Thanks, Rod. Oh, sorry, I can do this myself. Here we go. So I'm going to talk about some of the new pneumococcal vaccines. And I just want to identify the fact that I have taken the numbers 30, 24, 21, 15, 20, 10, 13 and 7 in tonight's Powerball. And if they come up, this will be the very last talk that I ever give at a prevention, and please don't copy them because then I won't get the full 100 million when they do. So these are my disclosures. I've worked with most vaccine companies in Australia. If there's any here, AstraZeneca I think is here, who haven't funded any of my research, please get in touch after the talk. I've received input from both MSD and Pfizer to a different degree, and I've also spoken to Securus about PPV23, but the views expressed are actually not the views of any of them, but are the views of myself. I want people to understand what's happening with pneumococcal disease, the way it's changed with vaccine policy, identify the remaining challenges and the future prospects to address this. And I want to identify the fact that because I only have 20 minutes, I will not explain the current pneumococcal vaccine policy in Australia because that's insufficient time to try and explain what the hell our policy is. So I'm only going to talk about more general stuff. I also want to make a plug. I want to acknowledge first the enormous work done by Professor Alan Cripps in this space, both for mucosal immunity and also in the application of his research into vaccine programs. He did pass in December last year after a fairly short illness. The Immunisation Coalition is running a seminar in August, I think August the 10th in the evening. Please look out for that. It'll be a much more detailed review of pneumococcal disease, and we hope to make that an annual Alan Cripps Memorial Seminar that we will run around pneumococcal disease. So pneumococcal disease is pretty straightforward. It's either invasive or non-invasive. The non-invasive is often in children, otitis media, sinusitis, and pneumonia. Invasive disease, which is less common, meningitis, bacteremia, and 25% of pneumonias are actually also invasive. In Australia, the incidence is largely around pneumococcal infection visits to general practice, but the cost of this is almost totally due to pneumococcal hospitalisations through pneumonia and to a much lesser extent due to invasive pneumococcal disease. So pneumococcal community-acquired pneumonia really important from the point of view of morbidity and hospitalisation, and invasive disease important due to the severity and sequelae. So, and you're going to hear a lot about serotype A, B, C, D and so on during this 20 minutes, but pneumococci are grouped into serotypes largely based on their polysaccharide capsules. And there's about 100 of these, and they are variably pathogenic and variably virulent depending on what the serotype capsule is doing. And the one on the right there, serotype 19F, is fairly typical of what we see with pneumococcal serotypes, that sort of wispy look to it. The one that I'm going to spend a bit of time on today is serotype 3, and that's what we call the sugar-coated killer. And it's got a very thick polysaccharide capsule. It works to stop our immune system. It protects against complement-mediated opsonization, keeps fluid in to stop desiccation and so on. So it is a serotype that we already have vaccines to protect against, but it manages to both have capacity within itself to protect itself against our antibodies, and also has the capacity to drift off bits of its capsule so that we waste some of our immune response fighting bits of capsule instead of fighting the actual bug itself. So it is associated with more severe disease. It's associated with an increased risk of fatality, and we've been vaccinating against it for over a decade and it ain't going away. So that's an important part of what I want to talk about. The other thing, similar to many of the things we've talked about today, is that those people who have chronic diseases do worse if they get invasive pneumococcal disease, if you've got liver disease or asthma, heart disease, lung disease, and so on, diabetes, then you're much more likely to get invasive pneumococcal disease and have a poorer outcome. And that's why, if you look up the ATAGI recommendations in the handbook, there's a lot of those things that are in the handbook that are recommended to be protected against pneumococcal disease. If you have 3 of these, then you're about 13 times more likely to get disease and have a poor outcome. So chronic disease and being aged is not a good prelude to what's going on. A lot of our approach to this changed with a study called Capita. And so the Netherlands had no pneumococcal vaccine program. They didn't have polysaccharide 23 or any of the conjugate vaccines, and they made a decision. Therefore, Pfizer made a decision that they could actually do a study in the Netherlands looking at whether or not conjugated vaccines would protect against community-acquired pneumonia. And that was important because we had, reasonable data that both the polysaccharide vaccine and the conjugate vaccine protected reasonably well against invasive pneumococcal disease. But there was a real debate as to whether or not, particularly the polysaccharide vaccine, protected against community-acquired pneumonia. And so this study really did start to show that there was a potential for pneumococcal vaccines to not just stop invasive disease, but also stop community-acquired pneumonia. And the outcome of that led to a lot of changes in recommendation moving forward as to whether we should be using conjugated vaccines, and led to the uptake of them in very many countries for their paediatric program, and more recently, some use of conjugated vaccines in older persons as well. So it was a thing that said, we have better vaccines and we're going to start using them and we're going to do better because of that. So what's happening with pneumococcal disease in Australia, and I want to break it up into 2 separate bits, what's happening in children and what's happening in people that look like me. And so this is IPD from 2009 to 2021 in children under 5. And the blue bars are residual disease due to serotypes in PCV7. Red bars, residual serotypes in the additional 6 in PCV13. And then the green are those that are not vaccine type serotypes for any conjugated vaccine. And you can see that we introduced the 3+0 schedule 12 years ago, realised we'd made a mistake, changed it to add a booster dose 5 years ago, and then had lots of confusing epidemiology because the pandemic came and we had new epidemiologists explaining how to resolve that. Where I was in Victoria, we had our main epidemiologist was a guy called Dan Andrews, and he explained that the virus was living 5.5 kilometres from where you were. So long as you only walked 5 kilometres from your house, that you're going to be safe. Shut the playgrounds, shut the schools, sent the kids home. There's a long list of the things he did. Managed to actually get rid of influenza. Made me wonder why I was a vaccinologist, because we didn't need vaccines, we just needed Dan. But really what happened is that the epi in 2020, 2021 was very confusing because we got rid of a lot of respiratory diseases for reasons that had nothing to do with vaccine. So if we look at older people, similar sort of story, and what you can see there is that when we introduce these, we get some benefit of herd immunity and a change in carriage in children, leading through to a change in disease in older people. Although sadly we're seeing continuing increases in serotypes that are not in current conjugated vaccines, but we're also seeing serotypes from PCV7 and PCV13 that continue, so that our current vaccines aren't getting rid of all of the serotypes that are in those particular vaccines. So we need to look at how to make them work better and how to cover some of that group which are in the green that are actually producing disease. And that's what's happening with PCV15 15, 20, 21, 24 and 30 as we move forward. Now, this is across all ages, and you can see a bit more obviously there that we've got problems with serotype 3, which is 12% of the total cases in 2021, higher in some other years. That was towards the end of the pandemic. Serotypes 22F and 33F are part of PCV 15, and we've still got some issues with 19A and 19F from both of those. If we look at those over 70, you can see the same sort of picture. Problems with 19F and 19A, big problem with serotype 3, an increased problem with 22F and 33F, and so when we look at what we're going to do moving forward, we have to address residual disease that's occurring both in adults and the paediatric population, older adults and those with chronic conditions at increased risk. And we have problems in particularly older people with both current vaccine serotypes and non-vaccine serotypes persisting. And so we need continued surveillance, which is pretty good in Australia, but pretty poor in most of the Asian countries I go to talk about this. And we need to look at how to improve things. So to reduce disease, we need vaccine with good effectiveness against prevailing serotypes, and we need to use them. And if you look at any of our data, it's not paediatric data, whether it's uptake of PPV 23 when it was available for 65-year-olds or PCV 13, now it's available for 70-year-olds, our coverage is poor. And so there's no good having really good vaccines if we don't actually put them in arms. And I've got a badge that says vaccines save lives. The reality is no vaccine saves lives unless it's actually stuck into somebody's arm at some stage. So this is the serotype distribution by vaccine type, and it's 2019 data before we had non-pharmaceutical interventions. And you can see that serotype 3 accounted for 25% of IPD cases. The dark green ones, the 22F and 23F, are the ones that are currently in both PCV 15 and PCV 20. The light blue ones are those that are in PCV 20 alone. And there's one, I can't tell the colour from here, I think it's purple, and that's the 9N, which is still causing cases, and probably be something we look at as to whether or not we keep using a polysaccharide because it's in that but not in any of the conjugated vaccines. So these are the ones that are currently registered in Australia. PCV 7 is no longer available. We're using PCV 13 and to a lesser extent 23, and we now have to varying extent the availability of PCV 15 and 20. And so which one should we use? And somebody who's on a fancy committee will tell us that at some stage. And secondly, is more better? If I have PCV 24 soon or PCV 30, is that better automatically than PCV 713? And one of the realities is, and a lot of these studies are based on something called non-inferiority studies. And that means if you can get to 50% of the immunogenicity of something beforehand, then you're non-inferior. And somebody pointed out to me the other day that if you keep doing that, you know, if you're then non-inferior to the non-inferior one that was 50% after a while, you wonder, even without a correlative protection, whether they still keep using it. So one of the challenges is the more you put in there, the harder it is to maintain the same sort of immune response against all the serotypes when you keep adding more in. So this is the grade review by NCIRS for 15, for PCV 15, and it looked at this compared to PCV 13. And essentially, in the midst of all of that, what they were saying was that, to nobody's surprise, PCV 15 gives you a better response to 22F and 33F than PCV 13, because PCV 13 didn't have those two. But the other thing it says was that they had statistically significantly higher immune responses to ST serotype 3 for 15 than 13. And this is the first time that we've really had something say, actually, we get a better response against serotype 3, which is our problem case. And so what that means I don't know. Obviously, I'm happier that we have a better immune response. We have no real world data. Will that actually produce a better clinical response is something that I'm hoping we get some information on soon. But obviously, something that produces a better immune response is something that is better than the existing thing, we hope. And really the case is that because of this, PBAC recommended PCV 15 in November 21, and 14 months later in January 23, it was added to the immunisation handbook as an option for adults. The paediatric PBAC recommendation came in March 23. I'm hoping the handbook recommendation follows soon, and that you'll have an opportunity to replace 13 with 15 in the paediatric program in the not too distant future under the NIP, because that hopefully will give us an improvement there. This is some ACIP data, because I actually couldn't find public reports of Australian data. And their concerns about this for the paediatric group with PCV20 was that they had numerically lower responses than PCV13. After post-dose 3, they did not meet non-inferiority criteria for some of their serotypes, although by dose 4, they pretty much met non-inferior criteria for all the PCV13. So the challenge for me, if that's correct and if that follows through, is that we may have a lesser response early on after 3 doses than we had with our previous vaccine. And so that's something we have to have a think about. We're balancing, will it be not quite as good as the existing ones, even though it will definitely be better for the 7 that were never there before. This is matching adjust indirect comparisons of pneumococcal vaccines of PCV 15 and 20. Companies don't get together and do a combined trial to say mine's better than yours or vice versa. They don't like doing that for reasons I don't understand. So this was a way of looking at it, and they looked at the comparison of 15 to 13 and 20 to 13, and what they decided was that you can see doing that, and I haven't seen this done much before, that PCV 15 on the right-hand side did better for a whole range of serotypes than PCV 20 in its response as a comparison of it against PCV 13 versus PCV 20 against PCV 13. So what does that mean? This is the current ATAGI recommendations for different groups. You can use 13 or 15 in adults, or in people with specific risk conditions, or in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. You can now use PCV 15 or Vaxneuvance in a range of different situations. ACIP has said that for adults over 65, and for people with underlying conditions, you have a choice. You can use PCV 20 or PCV 15 in series with PPSV 23. This is the working group consideration of BCCDC when they had a look at that. And they said the advantage of using PCV 20 alone in older people was that it was simple, it was cheaper, and it would provide better protection against those serotypes that are only in 20 and not in 15. But they didn't know the clinical significance of decreased immunogenicity. There was no data in immunocompromised adults, and you may lose some protection. The advantages of using both was that broader serotype coverage and was cost saving, but logistically more challenging. So one of the things that ATAGI will have to sort out, and they probably will say it's up to you, is it better to have one vaccine that's easy to give, or to have 2 together that might work better, but then you've got to make sure they get the second dose, and we already do pretty poorly with vaccination coverage for this. Very quickly, I want to talk about new ones. V116 or PCV21 has worked on the principle that we can't just keep adding. If we keep adding, then what happens is immunity against individuals drops down. So they've got rid of 8 of the original ones that were there in PCV 13, figuring that we're getting protection with our herd immunity against them, and they've added 8 new ones. which were in PPSV 23. And so what they're saying is that we're going to give the kids this 15, and then we're going to give different batch to the older people to cover some of the others, and that gives them an increase of anything up to 40% of serotype coverage. And I've only seen phase 1-2 data, so I'm not really sure how that'll go longer. So in summary, pneumococcal disease remains important. We need vaccines against emerging serotypes. We need them to work against serotypes of concern, especially serotype 3. And we've got to get the GPs to actually give the vaccines because they're not giving it at the moment. This is my last slide. You can see this is graphic. On the left-hand side, this is what ATAGI says people should get vaccine. It's diabetics, people with renal disease, people with heart disease, asthmatics, you name it. There's a graphic of those there. It's about 4 million people. And this on the other side is the federal government saying these are the people that we're funded for, and they're the 7 people down here, because you've got to have, asplenia. You can have renal disease, but only if your EGFR is less than 15, which means you've got 4 weeks to live. You can have a vaccine now, and so on. So really, it's not just a matter of we need to give it to them, but maybe we need to fund some of these vaccines rather than restricting it significantly. Sorry, I'm a minute over, but gee.
Well, a very straightforward subject. Thank you very much. So the questions go around what you've been saying, and good luck with your winning ticket tonight. Is it actually going to make a difference to 5-year-olds and greater than 70s because we've got them? That's the first question. Second one is, now that we've got the serotype 3 under control with all of our complicated work, what other stereotypes are going to take over and what are we going to have to do? You sort of answered that in the last one. Then the third part for you to address is introduction of the program should be able to adapt to improvements in the vaccine. So vaccines improve, so we should better change. Is it the changing vaccine that's causing our confusion? Is it the disease itself, or is it the way it's been introduced? I think I might know your answer for that.
The reason this is one of our worst programs is that it takes you half an hour to go through the handbook. You click on, have they ever had PPV 23, and then all the rest of it. Do they have this condition? They should have it, but no, that's not funded, and so on. So we need a simplification of our program is one of the things that we need in order to do it. We need to convince primary care physicians that this is a really important disease. I mean, we vaccinate our kids to 95%, but even in the days that we had, and we've had recommendations for pneumococcal vaccines for elderly for, a couple of decades at least, we get 75 to 80% of our elderly vaccinated with flu. I've never understood why at that time they don't say, and you need your pneumonia vaccine at the same time, but we've never had good coverage with that. Now, maybe GPs felt that PPSV 23 wasn't particularly good, so they didn't give it, but now we've got good vaccines. I hope they start giving it to them. So we need to keep chasing it. I mean, it's not as bad as COVID vaccines. It's not like neutralising antibodies disappear after 6 weeks and you're about to get your XBB vaccine and just having had your B45 and your B12 and so on. But serotype replacement happens, and we'll have to chase it to some extent, and it's good that vaccine companies are putting a lot of effort into looking at new ways to do it. The ones I haven't spoken about, PCV24 is using a different technology. There's only phase 1-2 data, but there's a chance that maybe moving away from our current approach to these will actually produce a vaccine that works more effectively and more broadly, but time will tell.
Will it cut down the disease?
Sorry?
Will it cut down the disease?
If you look at the introduction of vaccines, they've all cut down on disease, whether it was PCV 7, 13 or whatever.
It's just a question of how much.
Well, I think there's 2 parts to this. Firstly, I worry about 22F and 33. If you look like, there's about 10% in Australia. If you look like in places like Canada, they're a significant cause of antimicrobial resistance. And so one of the other reasons for using conjugated pneumococcal vaccine is that if you use them and you stop getting disease, you stop getting antibiotic resistance to the disease as well. And they are significantly associated with multi-drug resistance in Canada. And so they'll cut down on that 10% disease and hopefully stop that drug resistance coming here as well. Between 3 and 22F and 33F, we're talking about a quarter of our cases. They'll go down. They'll go back up again in totality because we'll get non-vaccine type serotype replacement. I mean, it's one of the realities of what happens. I think, oh no. Pfizer's going to tell me they disagree with everything I said about PCV20.
For full disclosure, my name is Claire. I'm Senior Medical Manager for Pfizer, looking after the pneumococcal portfolio. I am very new into the space of pneumococcal, but not vaccines. So I'm not about to bulldoze you in any way, Paul, but I just think it's important to highlight at this point in time the handbook has been recently updated to include both PCV15 and PCV20, with no preferential recommendation given between PCV13, 15 or 20. Of course, there is an NIP-funded vaccine, which remains to be PCV13 at this point in time, followed by the 23-valent, depending on the risk condition. As per the handbook, there is a nice big section at the beginning of the chapter highlighting that ATAGI are undergoing optimal review of the pneumococcal vaccination program. I can't speak anything about pediatrics because it's not registered for as of yet for the PCV20 in Australia, but of course there's going to be a comprehensive overview. In terms of the ACIP for the pediatrics review within the US, that will be coming out this evening / tomorrow morning.
Thank you. Now, do we have to give Merck a chance to...
Paul, I'm not from Merck. Thanks for your talk. I just wanted to comment on the race to increase additional serotypes in these vaccines. And I think in some ways we've lost focus on the serotypes that are actually causing disease. And from your figures, serotype 3 and 19F are causing more than a third of our notifications, and yet they're vaccine serotypes that are very poorly controlled. And moving from 7-valent to 13-valent vaccine actually saw us lose control of 19F, which was modest with 7, but is now much poorer with 13. I guess my question is, do you think we need to refocus the clinical development of these vaccines, not to be cramming in more serotypes, but to be considering what's actually causing disease and really focus on controlling serotype 3 better? I think it's useful that the 15-valent might produce more antibodies, but what effect that will have at a population level, I think is very unclear.
And I agree totally. I agree totally that it's hopeful, but I have no idea whether there'll be a clinical benefit of that. And I think it's not just 19F, but it's 19A as well as 19F that is, causing a fair amount of disease. Now, I'm not in charge of R&D budgets of companies, but I agree with you. I wish that we had a better response of our existing vaccines against some of those. Thank you.